Imagine being 8 months pregnant, standing in a room full of powerful executives, and listening to your own husband publicly humiliate you from the stage, while his mistress smiles in the front row. He thinks you are just a naive, penniless housewife who will quietly fade into the background. He thinks he has completely won. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He forgot to ask who your father really is. What happens when a social climbing, arrogant husband tries to discard his loyal wife, only to discover that she is the secret heiress to the very billionaire empire that owns his entire company? Tonight, we dive into a story of ultimate betrayal, devastating public humiliation, and a masterclass in silent, absolute revenge. This story is a powerful reminder. True strength does not have to be loud, and shrinking yourself to make a weak person feel tall will only lead to your own erasure. If you love stories where karma hits harder than a freight train, do me a favor, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their true worth. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our next thrilling tale. Let me know in the comments below, at what exact moment would you have walked out on him? Now, let the story begin.
Chapter 1. The Paint Nursery. You are not wearing that to the gala, are you? Vance asked. The words cut through the quiet warmth of the afternoon. Clara froze. She was kneeling on a canvas dropcloth in the center of the spare bedroom. The smell of fresh, bright yellow paint hung heavy in the air. Sunlight streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the tiny dust motes dancing in the room. She was 32 years old and exactly 8 months pregnant. Her lower back carried a dull, persistent ache, but until this exact second, she had been perfectly happy. She turned her head slowly. Vance stood in the doorway. He did not look at the freshly painted walls. He did not look at the crib she had spent 3 hours assembling the day before. He was staring directly at her stomach, or more specifically, at the faded cotton maternity dress draped over it. The paintbrush dropped into the tin. Splash. What do you mean? Clara asked. Her voice was steady, but her heart gave a sudden, uncomfortable flutter. Vance sighed. It was a heavy, exasperated sound. He walked into the room, stepping carefully over the protective canvas to avoid getting anything on his expensive leather shoes. The sharp, metallic click of his briefcase hitting the wooden floor echoed in the empty nursery. I mean exactly what I said, Clara, Vance replied. He loosened his silk tie, his jaw tense. That dress is worn out. The fabric looks cheap. This is the regional executive gala. Everyone who is anyone in the firm will be there. The senior partners, the board of directors. I just got promoted. I am finally stepping into the inner circle. I need my wife to look the part. Clara stared at him. She wiped a stray smudge of yellow paint from her cheek with the back of her wrist. The soft, plush baby blanket she had folded neatly on the nursing chair suddenly caught her eye. She had bought it yesterday. It was soft, simple, and perfect, just like she wanted her life to be. 5 years ago, she had walked away from a world of suffocating wealth, cold mansions, and relentless judgment to find a man who would love her in a simple, quiet home for 4.5 years. She thought she had found exactly that, but over the last 6 months, Vance had changed. I bought this dress 2 weeks ago, Clara said, her voice dropping an octave. It is comfortable. My ankles are swollen. Vance, I am carrying our child. I thought the dark blue color looked elegant enough for a company dinner. Vance pinched the bridge of his nose. He closed his eyes, adopting the expression of a man forced to explain simple arithmetic to a stubborn child. It is not a company dinner. Clara, it is a gala. It is an event that defines trajectories. And your ankles. He paused, looking down at her bare feet on the drop cloth. Your ankles are swollen. Exactly. You cannot wear flat shoes to the starlight room. You need to find a dress that sweeps the floor, something that hides the swelling, something that looks like it belongs to the wife of a senior vice president. He did not step forward to help her up from the floor. He did not ask how her back felt. He just delivered his critique and turned toward the hallway. Clara placed her hands on her heavy stomach. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs. She took a deep, shaky breath. He is just stressed, she told herself. The new promotion is a lot of pressure. He is just worried about providing for us. But her inner voice, the quiet, sharp instinct she had buried for years, spoke a different truth. He is embarrassed of me. He looks at me and sees a liability. Clara grabbed the edge of the windowsill and pulled herself up. Her joints popped. The physical weight of the pregnancy was exhausting, but the sudden, invisible weight pressing down on her chest was far worse. She walked out of the nursery, leaving the yellow paint unfinished. She found Vance in the kitchen. He was standing by the marble island, pouring a glass of iced water. The ice cubes clinked sharply against the crystal glass. He was already scrolling through his phone. His thumb moved with frantic, calculated speed. He did not look up when she entered the room. Clara stood by the doorway. She wanted to bridge the gap. She wanted the man who used to bring her wildflowers and laugh at her burnt toast. She walked over to him, wrapping her arms gently around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his stiff shoulder. Vance immediately stiffened. He did not lean into her touch. Within 2 seconds, he pulled away, taking a large step to the left. I am sweating. Clara, I had a long commute, he muttered, keeping his eyes glued to his phone screen. The rejection was physical. It felt like a slap in the face. Clara let her arms fall to her sides. She stared at the back of his tailored suit jacket. It was a new suit, navy blue, imported Italian wool. He had spent $3,000 on it last week, claiming he needed to dress for the job he wanted, not the job he had. Clara had smiled and supported him, even though she had been clipping grocery coupons to save for the baby's college fund. Who are you texting? Clara asked. Her voice was completely flat. Vance locked the phone instantly. The screen went black. He slipped the device into his breast pocket with a smooth, practiced motion. Just the office, Vance said lightly. Too lightly. Finalizing the seating chart for Friday night. We are seated at table 4, right next to the regional director. It is a huge honor, which is why I need you to go shopping tomorrow. Buy something sophisticated. Use the joint credit card. Do not look at the price tag. Clara walked around the kitchen island, forcing him to look at her. I do not want to go shopping tomorrow. Vance, I am tired. I am huge. I just want to finish painting the nursery. The nursery can wait. Vance snapped. His voice was suddenly sharp, losing its polished corporate edge. This gala cannot wait. Do you not understand how important this is? My entire career is riding on how I present myself to the board. We need to project success. We need to look wealthy. We need to look like we belong in their world. Clara felt a bitter smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Their world. If Vance only knew the world she had come from, if he only knew the sprawling estates, the private jets, the suffocating galas she had attended before she even turned 18. She knew those people better than he ever would. She knew their cruelty. She knew their obsession with image. She had run away from it, only to watch the man she married sprint directly toward it. I will find something to wear, Clara said quietly. Thank you, Vance said. He picked up his briefcase. I am going to the study. I have more emails to send. Can you heat up dinner? I do not have time to sit down. He walked out of the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Clara stood alone in the silence. The refrigerator hummed a low, constant drone. The smell of the yellow paint drifted down the hallway, mixing with the scent of the roasted chicken she had left in the oven. Everything looked perfect. They had a beautiful suburban home. They had a baby on the way. Vance had a lucrative career. It was a brilliant summer of a life, but the air was suffocating. Clara walked over to the kitchen counter. She picked up her own phone. The screen was dark. She stared at the blank, black glass. She felt a sudden, irrational surge of anxiety gripping her throat. She pressed her thumb to the screen 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. She did not have any new messages. She was not waiting for anyone. She was just trying to ground herself in the physical world. She was trying to prove to herself that her hands were real, that her life was real. But the creeping unease would not stop. It crawled up her spine like ice water. I am not going crazy, she thought. Something is wrong. The ground beneath me is shifting, and I am the only one who feels the tremor. She placed the phone face down on the granite counter. She walked over to the oven and pulled out the roasted chicken. The skin was perfectly golden. The potatoes were soft and fragrant. She plated a large portion for Vance, carrying it carefully down the hall to his study. The study door was closed. A thin line of light spilled out from underneath the heavy mahogany wood. Clara raised her hand to knock, but she stopped. She could hear his voice inside. He was not typing emails. He was on the phone. I know, Vance was saying, his tone completely different from the one he had used in the nursery. It was warm. It was relaxed. It was the voice he used to use with her. Yes, table 4. I made sure of it. Clara stood perfectly still in the hallway, holding the warm plate of food. No, do not worry about that. Vance laughed softly. It was a rich, genuine laugh. She is going to stay in the background. You know how she is. She gets overwhelmed by crowds. She is completely out of her element with people like us. Clara closed her eyes. People like us. Exactly, Vance continued. Friday is our night. I promise you. Just wear that red dress. The one you bought in Milan. The plate in Clara's hands felt incredibly heavy. The heat from the ceramic dish burned her palms, but she did not move. She did not breathe. The brilliant summer of her life was cracking, fracturing right down the middle, revealing a dark, endless void beneath. He is talking to a woman, Clara thought. The realization did not come as a question. It arrived as an absolute, undeniable fact. He is planning the biggest night of his career with another woman. Clara did not barge into the room. She did not scream. She did not throw the plate of food against the wall. The years of rigorous, high society training she thought she had left behind instantly kicked in. Emotion was a weakness. Composure was power. She took a slow, silent step backward, then another. She walked back to the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. She set the plate down on the counter. She looked at the perfectly roasted chicken, the carefully seasoned potatoes. She felt sick to her stomach. She turned off the kitchen lights. The room fell into shadows, illuminated only by the pale moonlight spilling through the window over the sink. Clara leaned against the counter, wrapping her arms protectively around her swollen belly. The baby shifted again, a slow, rolling movement that usually brought her immense joy. Tonight it brought a fierce, territorial terror. She had given up her empire for this man. She had hidden her last name, her trusts, her inheritance, and her father's terrifying legacy, all because Vance had told her he loved her simple, unpolished heart. He had sworn he did not care about money. He had sworn he only cared about building a life together, piece by piece, with their own two hands. It was all a lie. The moment he got a taste of real money, a taste of corporate power, he became addicted. And in his pursuit of that power, he had looked at Clara and decided she was not enough. He decided she was a peasant dragging him down. Clara looked out the window at the quiet suburban street. The streetlights flickered against the dark pavement. You think I am weak, Clara whispered to the empty room. You think I am ordinary. She did not shed a single tear. The sadness she had felt in the nursery was gone, completely evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard clarity began to settle over her. It was the first autumn rain, washing away the illusion of her marriage. She reached for her phone again. She picked it up and held it tightly in her hand. She did not unlock it this time. She just held it, feeling the cold metal edges against her skin. Friday was the gala. Friday was the night Vance planned to establish his new life, his new image, and apparently, his new woman. He wanted to use Clara as a prop, a pregnant, pitiful wife sitting in the background while he charmed the elite. Clara took a deep breath. The smell of yellow paint was completely gone, replaced by the bitter, metallic scent of absolute betrayal. I deserve better than this, she thought, her inner voice ringing with the clarity of a church bell. I will not be humiliated. I will not be replaced. She turned away from the window, and walked back toward the bedroom. She had a gala to prepare for, and Vance was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to discard a woman who holds the world in the palm of her hand. Chapter 2. The fitting room. The air inside Eleanor's evening wear was suffocating. It smelled aggressively of polished brass, heavily starched silk, and lavender. Lavender. Beatrice always wore lavender. It was a thick, cloying scent that clung to everything she touched. Clara stood near the back of the boutique, her hand resting instinctively on her swollen stomach, watching her mother-in-law rifle through a rack of heavy velvet gowns. You need structure, Clara, Beatrice announced loudly. She did not look back. She just tossed a dark, shapeless plum dress over her arm. Pregnancy is natural, of course, but there is no need to flaunt it in a room full of executives. You need to look dignified, not domestic. Clara bit her tongue. She looked over at Vance. He was sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the center of the showroom, one leg crossed over the other. His head was down. His thumb was swiping rapidly across his phone screen. He had not looked up once since they walked through the glass doors 20 minutes ago. Vance, what do you think? Clara asked softly, pointing to a simple, elegant navy blue slip dress on a mannequin. Vance did not look up. Whatever my mother suggests is fine. Clara, just put it on the card. Beatrice turned around with a triumphant smile. She marched over to Clara and shoved the plum dress into her hands. The fabric felt awful. It was stiff, heavy, and lined with scratchy tulle. It was the kind of dress designed to hide a woman, to make her fade into the wallpaper. Go on, Beatrice urged, waving a manicured hand toward the fitting rooms. Put it on. We do not have all day. Clara took the heavy garment and walked slowly toward the back of the store. The fitting room was large, lined with three-way mirrors and blinding fluorescent lights. She closed the heavy wooden door behind her, leaned against it, and closed her eyes. Her back was aching terribly today. She just wanted to go home. She wanted to sit in the nursery and listen to the quiet. She began the slow, exhausting process of unzipping her comfortable clothes. As she pulled the stiff plum fabric over her head, the scratchy tool immediately scraped against her sensitive skin. It was tight in the chest and impossibly loose in the stomach. She looked in the mirror. She looked like a bruised, shapeless shadow. Before she could reach around to pull the zipper down, the little silver bell above the boutique door chimed brightly. Vance, Beatrice, I did not expect to see you two here. The voice was bright, sharp, and dripping with polished confidence. Clara froze in the fitting room. Her hands hovered over the zipper on her back. She knew that voice. She had heard it a dozen times over the phone when Vance was supposedly on conference calls. It was Jillian. Jillian, darling. Beatrice cried out. The warmth in her mother-in-law's voice was something Clara had never, not once in 5 years, received. Look at you. You look absolutely stunning. Are you shopping for Friday night? I am, Jillian answered. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. Growing closer to the fitting area, Vance convinced me to upgrade my wardrobe. He said table 4 requires a certain standard. Clara stopped breathing. Vance convinced me. Well, he is absolutely right. Beatrice said. Table 4 is directly next to the regional director. Vance cannot have anyone dragging down his image tonight. Honestly, Jillian, I am so glad you will be there to help him network. You always know exactly what to say to the board. It is a partnership. Beatrice, Jillian said smoothly. Her voice carried clearly over the thin wooden door of the fitting room. Vance and I make a great team. We understand each other. I just wish. Beatrice lowered her voice slightly, but not enough. I just wish he had realized that before he settled down. Clara is a sweet girl, of course, but she is just so. Suburban, she lacks pedigree. She has no ambition. She is going to look completely lost in the starlight room. Clara stared at her own reflection in the three-way mirror. The harsh lighting captured every shadow under her eyes, every exhausted line on her face. She waited for Vance to speak. She waited for her husband to defend her. She waited for the man who promised to protect her to shut down this cruel, casual dissection of her character. The silence stretched. The boutique clock ticked on the wall. Tick, tock, tick. She will stay out of the way, Vance finally said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any affection. It is just one night. Once the baby comes, her focus will be entirely at home. She will not be attending these corporate events anymore. You and I can handle the public-facing duties. Jillian, perfect. Jillian purred, because honestly, Vance, dragging a heavily pregnant housewife to an executive gala is practically a cry for help. People will pity you. They will not pity me after Friday, Vance replied. Clara stood frozen in the heavy, scratchy dress. The tulle dug into her shoulders. The lavender perfume seeped under the door, suffocating her. They were talking about her as if she was already gone. They were erasing her right in front of her face. Vance was not just having a physical affair with this woman. He was replacing Clara in every aspect of his life. He was presenting Jillian to his mother, to his colleagues, to his future, while boxing Clara into a quiet, forgotten corner. She looked at her reflection. She saw the girl who had run away from her father's towering glass skyscrapers. She saw the girl who had given up her trust fund, her security, and her last name, all to build a life with a man who was currently apologizing for her existence. God, I was so stupid. All the signs were there. She did not cry. The tears would not come. Instead, a slow, freezing anger began to pool in her chest. I am not crazy. I know what I heard. He never loved me. He loved the mirror I held up for him. And now that he wants a bigger mirror, he is throwing me away. Clara unzipped the ugly plum dress. She let it fall to the floor in a heavy heap. She stepped out of it, leaving it crumpled on the carpet. She put her comfortable maternity clothes back on. She smoothed down the front of her shirt, took a deep breath, and opened the fitting room door. The three of them were standing near the front counter. Jillian was holding a breathtaking crimson silk gown. Beatrice was nodding in approval. Vance was smiling a real, genuine smile that Clara had not seen directed at her in months. They all turned when the fitting room door clicked open. Did it fit? Beatrice asked, her smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a tight, Critical line. No, Clara said evenly. Her voice was perfectly calm. She did not look at Jillian. She looked directly into Vance's eyes. It was suffocating. I am going home. Clara, you need a dress, Vance said, his tone sharpening with irritation. I will wear something I already own, Clara replied. She walked past them, not waiting for an argument. She pushed open the glass door of the boutique and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. Clara, do not be ridiculous. Vance called out from the doorway, but she did not turn back. She kept walking down the sidewalk, her head held high, until she reached her car. She unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and shut it firmly behind her. She did not start the engine. She sat in the heavy silence of the vehicle. The sky above had turned a bruised, angry gray. A moment later, the first drops of rain began to fall. It started as a light tapping against the glass, then quickly escalated into a steady, rhythmic drumming. Clara sat in the parked car, entirely alone. She stared at the steering wheel. She reached out and traced the leather stitching with her index finger, over and over, left to right, right to left. She sat there for 4 long minutes. She listened to the rain hit the windshield. The world outside the glass was blurred and distorted by the water. But the world inside her mind had never been clearer. She was not going to hide in the background on Friday night. She was not going to let a mediocre man and his arrogant mistress humiliate her in front of a room full of people she had practically grown up managing. Vance wanted a wife who looked like she belonged in the inner circle. He wanted a partner with power. He wanted a woman who commanded respect from the board of directors. Clara leaned her head back against the headrest. A cold, dangerous smile touched her lips. Starting over feels impossible, but staying is worse. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life as she pulled out of the parking space and merged into the rainy traffic. Clara already knew exactly what she was going to wear to the Starlight Room, and she knew exactly who she was going to call when she got home. Chapter 3. The Overheard Truth. The coffee in her mug had gone completely cold. Clara took a sip anyway. It was bitter. It tasted like burnt ash and regret. She stood in her immaculate kitchen, staring at the black leather folder sitting on the granite island. Vance had left the house in a frantic rush 45 minutes ago, in his panic about a morning briefing. He had left the executive summary folder for the gala sitting right next to the fruit bowl. Normally, Clara would have let him figure it out. Normally, she would have waited for his panicked phone call. But today was not a normal day. It was 24 hours after the incident at the boutique, and the cold, terrible clarity had not left her. She needed to see him in his element. She needed to look at his world one last time before she decided exactly how to burn it down. Clara picked up the folder. It was heavy, stamped with the gold foil logo of his firm. She dressed carefully, putting on a sharp black maternity blazer and comfortable slacks. She drove into the city. The corporate headquarters of Vance S. Firm occupied the top 10 floors of a towering glass high-rise. Clara stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor. The air up here was thin. heavily air conditioned, and smelled faintly of expensive printer ink and bleached carpets. The receptionist, a young woman named Haley, looked up from her computer. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Clara S. heavily pregnant figure. Mrs. Sterling, Haley said. Her voice was polite, but there was a strange, tight awkwardness around her mouth. We did not expect you today. Vance forgot his folder for the board briefing. Clara answered, holding up the black leather binder. I thought I would save him a trip home. Oh, Haley said. She glanced quickly down the long hallway, then back to Clara. He is in his office, but he asked not to be disturbed. He is having a closed-door meeting with Miss Jillian. I will not disturb them, Clara said smoothly. I will just slip this onto his secretary's desk. Haley hesitated, but Clara did not wait for permission. She walked past the reception desk, her flat shoes sinking quietly into the thick carpet. The hallway was quiet. Most of the executives were in the boardroom. Vance S. corner office was at the very end of the corridor. As Clara approached, she noticed that the door was not entirely closed. It was cracked open just an inch. Clara stopped. The heavy thud of her heartbeat echoed in her ears. She reached out to push the door open, but the sound of Vance's voice stopped her hand midair. You are overreacting. Jillian, it is just for a few more months. Clara stood perfectly still, standing outside his office door. The illusion of her marriage shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. A few more months, Jillian asked. Her voice was sharp, echoing through the small opening. You told me you were going to handle this before the gala, Vance. Now you want me to sit at table 4 and pretend we are just colleagues, while she sits there playing the dutiful, pregnant wife. She is not playing anything, Vance answered. His tone was cold, calculating. It was a voice Clara had never heard directed at her, but one he clearly used often. She is clueless. She has no idea, and we need to keep it that way until the baby is born. Clara stopped breathing. She pressed her back against the cool wall beside the doorframe. Why wait? Jillian demanded. You said you did not love her. You said it was a mistake. It was a mistake, Vance said with a heavy sigh. But let us be rational about this. If I file for divorce right now, while she is 8 months pregnant, how do you think that looks to the board? I will look like a monster. The senior partners value family image. I just got promoted. I cannot have a messy public divorce dragging my name through the mud. So what is the plan? Jillian asked, her voice softening slightly. The plan is exactly what we discussed. Vance answered patiently. We get through the gala. I secure my position with the regional director. She has the baby in a month. I play the supportive father for 6 weeks. Once the dust settles and everyone sees I am taking care of the child financially, I file the papers. I will claim we just grew apart. I keep my reputation. I keep my job. And I get to be with you, openly. Clara closed her eyes. The floor felt like it was tilting beneath her feet. I just hate looking at her, Jillian said bitterly. She is so plain. Vance, she has no connections. She has no money. Why did you even marry her in the first place? There was a long silence. Clara heard the sound of ice clinking against glass. Vance was pouring a drink. Because she was easy, Vance finally said, the words hit Clara like a physical blow. When I met her, I was a junior associate. I needed someone stable. I needed someone who would not ask questions, who would just keep the house clean and make me look like a solid, dependable family man. She was a charity case. Jillian, she had no family of her own. She clung to me. It made sense at the time. The air in Clara's lungs turned to shattered glass. But you outgrew her, Jillian purred. I outgrew her 3 years ago, Vance agreed. She is dead weight, but I am handling it. You just need to be patient. Friday night is about establishing you as my true partner to the people who matter. Let Clara sit in the corner. She will be gone soon enough. Clara did not gasp. She did not cry out. She turned away from the door. She walked back down the hallway, her legs moving automatically. She did not stop at the receptionist's desk. She walked straight to the heavy glass doors leading to the stairwell and pushed them open. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, sealing her in the concrete echo chamber. Clara walked down half a flight of stairs and sat on the cold concrete step. It was quiet here. There was no printer noise. There was no smell of expensive cologne. There was only the harsh, fluorescent lighting and the sound of her own breathing. She wrapped her arms around her stomach. The baby was perfectly still. He called me a charity case, Clara thought. He called me dead weight. She stared at the concrete wall. She was processing the betrayal, not with tears, but with a terrifying, clinical precision. For 5 years, she had contorted herself to fit into his life. She had clipped coupons. She had cooked his meals. She had swallowed her pride and tolerated his mother's endless insults. She had done it all because she believed he loved her for who she was, not for what she could do for him. But it was all a calculation. He had selected her like a piece of sensible furniture. And now that he had moved into a bigger, better office, he was throwing her out on the curb. Clara sat in the stairwell for a long time. She had to choose between her dignity and her security. Both felt impossible to lose. A child needed a father. Did they not? But did a child need a father who despised its mother? Did a child need a father who could so casually plan to destroy his family for a promotion? She knew people judged women for staying in bad marriages. They always said, just leave. But unless you have been in that situation, unless you have built an entire world around a man and carry his child in your body, you cannot understand the gravity of walking out the door. The fear is paralyzing. The shame is suffocating. But the fear was suddenly gone. The shame was gone. Clara looked down at her hands. They were not shaking anymore. I am not crazy. Clara whispered to the empty stairwell. I know what I heard. He never loved me. He loved the mirror I held up for him. He loved the power he had over me. She placed a hand flat against the cold concrete wall and pushed herself up. She did not feel weak. She did not feel like a charity case. She felt a profound, dangerous awakening. Vance thought she had no family. He thought she had no money. He thought she was a helpless, isolated housewife who would quietly accept a divorce settlement and fade into obscurity. He had built his entire escape plan on the assumption that she was powerless. He had no idea who he had married. Clara opened her purse. She took out the black leather folder she had brought from home. She walked back up the half flight of stairs and pushed open the door to the 42nd floor. Haley, the receptionist, looked up in surprise. Mrs. Sterling, I thought you had left. I did, Clara said. She walked over to the reception desk and dropped the heavy black folder directly onto Haley's keyboard. Make sure my husband gets this before his meeting. Tell him I dropped it off. Tell him I hope it helps him secure his future. I will, Haley said nervously. Clara turned around and walked toward the elevators. She pressed the down button. The elevator dinged immediately. The steel doors slid open. As she stepped inside, Clara pulled her phone out of her purse. She did not lock and unlock the screen. She opened her contacts list. She scrolled past the local grocery store. She scrolled past Beatrice's number. She scrolled all the way to the bottom, to a number she had hidden under a fake name for 5 years. She pressed call. The phone rang twice. Hello, a deep, familiar voice answered. Clara took a deep breath. Brooks. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The background noise of a busy boardroom instantly went completely silent. Clara, her brother said. His voice was thick with shock and an undercurrent of fierce, immediate loyalty. Is it really you? Are you all right? I need you, Clara said simply. Her voice did not waver. And I need Dad. Where are you? Brooks asked instantly. No questions about why she left. No demands for an apology. Just action. I am in the city, Clara answered. The elevator descended rapidly, leaving the 42nd floor far behind. And Brooks, I need you to do something for me. Anything, Brooks said. Vance's firm, Clara said, watching the floor numbers drop on the digital display. Find out who owns their corporate debt and find out exactly what it takes to buy it. Give me an hour, Brooks answered, his voice turning ice cold. Consider it done. I am coming to get you. No, Clara said. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors slid open to reveal the bustling, sunny street outside. Do not come get me. Not yet. I have a gala to attend on Friday, and I want you to meet me there. Clara ended the call. She stepped out of the elevator and walked out into the brilliant afternoon sun. The dull ache in her chest was entirely gone, replaced by a steady, powerful rhythm. The falling leaves of her old life had finally settled on the ground. Winter was coming, and Clara was bringing the storm with her. Chapter 4. The quiet preparation. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday. The house was completely silent. Down the hall, in the master bedroom, Vance was deeply asleep. Clara could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of his breathing. For 4 years, that sound had been her comfort. It had been the anchor that kept her grounded in this quiet suburban life. Tonight, it sounded like the ticking of a bomb. Clara stood in the middle of the dark nursery. She did not turn on the overhead light. The pale moonlight filtering through the window was enough. Her hands were trembling slightly. It was not fear, it was adrenaline. It was the physical manifestation of a woman watching her entire universe collapse and deciding not to look away. The heavy thump of her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Thump, thump, thump. She walked over to the white wooden dresser. She opened the top drawer. Inside lay rows of tiny, pristine baby socks. She needed to do something with her hands. She needed to anchor herself before the storm arrived. Clara pulled all the tiny white socks out of the drawer and dumped them onto the changing table. She began to fold them, one by one, over and over. Her hands moved with a mechanical precision. She matched the heels. She smoothed the cotton. She folded the cuffs. It was a completely universal action. Any mother, in any era, in any crisis, knew the grounding power of preparing for a child. She stood there for 20 minutes. Complete silence filled the room, broken only by her steady breathing. The trembling in her fingers slowly faded away. She placed the perfectly organized rows back into the drawer. She closed it gently. She was ready. The hardest part was not making the decision to leave. The hardest part was admitting she had known the truth all along. She had seen the signs, the late nights, the hidden phone screens, the sudden, cruel criticisms. She had just chosen to paint over them, like laying fresh yellow paint over a rotting wall. But the rot always showed through eventually. Clara walked back down the hallway. She did not go back to bed. She went into the spare guest room and pulled a small, black leather overnight bag from the top shelf of the closet. She packed methodically. She did not pack everything she owned. She did not need to. Where she was going, she could buy 100 suburban houses without checking her bank balance. She packed only what mattered: the baby blanket, her prenatal vitamins, her passport. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Clara walked into the master bedroom. Vance was still asleep. She stood beside the heavy oak dresser. Right in the center sat their framed wedding photograph. In the picture, Vance was smiling brightly, holding her hands. Clara was looking up at him with absolute, blind devotion. She reached out and touched the frame. The smooth glass was ice cold against her fingertips. She did not throw it across the room. She did not shatter the glass. She simply picked it up and placed it face down on the polished wood. The quiet click of the frame hitting the dresser felt incredibly final. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Vance was rushing around the house, frantic and sharply dressed. "Did you pick up my dry cleaning?" Vance shouted from the hallway, aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie. "It is hanging on the door." Clara answered calmly from the kitchen. Vance marched into the kitchen, smelling heavily of sharp, citrus cologne. He looked at her critically. She was wearing a simple, dark robe. Her hair was pulled back. "You need to start getting ready." Vance snapped, checking his gold wristwatch. "The cocktail hour starts at 6. We cannot be late." The regional director is a stickler for punctuality. "And Clara, please do something with your hair. You look exhausted. I am getting ready now," Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly even. Vance did not notice her tone. He did not notice the missing wedding photo on the dresser. He did not notice the small overnight bag tucked carefully by the back door. He only saw his own reflection in the hallway mirror. Just remember the plan for tonight, Vance said, his eyes glued to his phone screen. You stay seated. If anyone asks, you are feeling fatigued from the pregnancy. I will do the talking. Jillian will be there to help me introduce you to the board. So just smile and let us handle the conversation. Clara looked at him. She really looked at him. She saw the weak, insecure man hiding behind an expensive Italian suit. He was so incredibly arrogant. He built his house of cards on the assumption that she was weak. I will smile, Clara said softly. Vance grabbed his keys. I have to go early to check the seating arrangements. Take an Uber to the hotel. Meet me in the lobby at 6:15. Do not be late. He walked out the door without kissing her goodbye. The heavy front door slammed shut. Clara was completely alone. She walked into the bathroom and locked the door. She took a long, hot shower, washing away the smell of the suburban house, washing away the ghost of the woman who used to apologize for taking up space. When she stepped out, she walked to her closet. She reached behind the row of cheap, comfortable maternity clothes she had worn for the last 8 months. From the very back, hidden inside a dark garment bag, she pulled out a dress. She had not bought it at Eleanor S. Evening Wear. She had not used Vance S. credit card. It was a custom made, midnight black maternity gown. It was constructed from pure, heavy silk that draped flawlessly over her curves. It did not have scratchy tulle. It did not try to hide her pregnancy. It celebrated it, demanding attention and respect. Clara slipped the dress on. It fit perfectly. The silk slid against her skin like cool water. She sat at her vanity and applied her makeup. She did not use the soft, neutral tones Vance always preferred. She chose a sharp, defining eyeliner. She applied a bold, deep crimson lipstick. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. A single text message glowed on the screen. It was from Brooks. The debt has been acquired. The trap is set. We are 10 minutes away. Clara picked up the phone and typed a single word in response. Good. She stood up and looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was not the meek, invisible housewife who had cried in the painted nursery. This woman was a predator. She was Clara Harrison, and she was going to war. She picked up her small black clutch purse. The zipper slid shut. Zzzt, finality. Tonight wasn't just a gala anymore. It was an execution. Chapter 5. The glass room, the Uber, pulled up to the grand entrance of the Starlight Room exactly at 6:15. Clara stepped out of the car. The humid evening air immediately hit her skin, but it was quickly replaced by the heavy, suffocating air conditioning of the hotel lobby. The space was a chaotic sea of tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. The sharp, bright flash of event cameras blinded her for a fraction of a second. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and the metallic tang of anxiety. Vance was waiting near the coat check. When he saw Clara walking toward him, he physically jolted. He blinked, staring at her as if she were a stranger. He had expected the worn out, swollen woman in the faded plum dress. He had expected a woman who would naturally shrink into the background. Instead, Clara moved with the grace of a woman who owned the building. The midnight black silk draped beautifully over her 8-month pregnancy. The deep crimson lipstick made her skin look like porcelain. She did not look away when he stared at her. She met his eyes directly. For a second, Vance looked genuinely unnerved, but his ambition quickly overrode his confusion. "You look different," Vance said, his eyes darting nervously toward a group of executives standing nearby. "Let us get you seated. The lobby is too crowded. You should not be on your feet." He did not offer her his arm. He simply turned and walked briskly toward the grand ballroom. Clara followed him, the heavy silk of her dress sweeping silently across the polished marble floor. The ballroom was enormous. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling. The constant, overlapping clinking of crystal champagne flutes echoed across the room like breaking glass. It was supposed to be a celebration, but to Clara, the room felt like a giant, suffocating glass cage. The heat of 300 bodies packed into the space was overwhelming. Vance walked past the front of the room. He walked past table 1. He walked past table 4, which was positioned directly in front of the grand stage, decorated with a towering centerpiece of white orchids. He kept walking. He led Clara all the way to the very back of the ballroom. They stopped at table 42. It was practically pressed against the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. The smell of roasted meat and heavy garlic wafted through the doors every time a waiter pushed past. "Here we are," Vance said smoothly. "I thought this would be much better for you. It is close to the exits in case you need the restroom, and it is away from the speakers, so the noise will not bother the baby." Clara looked at the table. It was occupied by junior analysts and plus ones who looked entirely bored. Table 4 was too crowded, Clara asked. Her voice was cold, completely devoid of emotion. "Exactly," Vance answered quickly, checking his gold watch. "It is packed up there, mostly senior partners. You would be miserable. Look, I have to go network before the regional director arrives. Just order a sparkling water. I will check on you before the speeches begin." He turned and practically sprinted back toward the front of the room. Clara pulled out her own chair and sat down. She did not look at the junior analysts. She kept her eyes fixed on table 4. 10 minutes later, Jillian arrived. She walked through the center aisle of the ballroom, making sure every eye in the room was on her. She was wearing the red silk dress from Milan. It was stunning, clinging to her slim figure. Around her neck rested a heavy diamond necklace that caught the light of the chandeliers. Vance met her halfway. He smiled. It was the wide, charismatic smile he used to reserve for Clara. He placed a hand gently on the small of Jillian's back and guided her directly to table 4. He pulled out the chair directly to his right, the seat of honor. Clara watched from the shadows of the kitchen doors. The regional director, an older, distinguished man with silver hair, approached table 4. Vance stood up immediately. shaking the man's hand with aggressive enthusiasm. Vance then gestured to Jillian. The regional director smiled warmly. Taking Jillian S. hand and giving it a respectful nod, Jillian laughed. Leaning into Vance S.'s shoulder, they looked like a power couple. They looked exactly like the image Vance wanted to project to the board, and the board was buying it completely. They assumed Jillian was the essential partner, the woman behind the rising star. Clara sat alone in the back of the room. The isolation was absolute, but she did not cry. The early winter frost had settled deep into her bones. The anger had frozen into a terrifying composure. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible, Clara thought. I made myself small so a weak man could feel tall. But tonight, I take my eyes back. Tonight, they will all see me. The dinner service began. The waitstaff flooded out of the kitchen doors behind Clara, carrying silver trays of heavy, rich food. The noise at table 42 grew louder. Two women sitting next to Clara were whispering aggressively about the company's new dress code. They completely ignored Clara's presence. Clara felt a sudden, intense wave of alienation. The room was spinning with noise and flashing lights. To anchor herself, she looked down at her plate. She picked up her silver butter knife. She reached for the small, round dinner roll on her bread plate. With slow, deliberate precision, she began to cut the bread. She did not cut it in half. She sliced it into tiny, perfectly even squares. One horizontal cut, one vertical cut, over and over. She focused entirely on the blade, pressing through the soft bread. She stared at the perfect little squares. It was a universal defense mechanism. If she focused on the bread, she did not have to make eye contact with the whispering women. If she focused on the bread, she did not have to watch Vance whisper into Jillian's ear. She set the knife down. Next to her plate was a crystal goblet of iced water. The humidity in the room had caused condensation to build on the outside of the glass. Clara leaned forward. She stared at a single drop of water forming near the rim. She watched it swell. She watched it tremble. And then she watched it roll slowly down the side of the glass, leaving a clear, wet trail behind it. She pretended to be entirely fascinated by this tiny physical event. Lock, unlock. The mirror of her own anxiety was right there in the glass. She was waiting. Every second that ticked by was a second closer to the end of Vance's career. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the low roar of the ballroom. Tap, tap. It was the screech of microphone feedback. The lights in the chandelier slowly dimmed, casting a dramatic shadow over the back of the room, while a blinding white spotlight illuminated the grand stage. The regional director stood at the podium, tapping the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, his booming voice echoed through the speakers. If I could have your attention, it is time to honor the individuals who will lead this firm into the future. Clara stopped staring at the water glass. She pushed her chair back slightly, giving herself a clear, unobstructed view of the stage. She placed her hands protectively over her stomach. Vance was adjusting his tie, practically glowing with anticipation. Jillian reached over and squeezed his hand. The trap was fully set. The execution was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Humiliation. The regional director cleared his throat. The screech of the microphone feedback faded, replaced by the heavy, expectant silence of 300 executives. This year has been one of unprecedented growth, the director announced, his silver hair catching the blinding white spotlight. And that growth was driven by individuals who understand sacrifice. Individuals who know that success is not a 9 to 5 commitment. It is a lifestyle. It is my profound honor to present the award for Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisition to a man who embodies our core values. Please welcome Vance Sterling. The ballroom erupted into applause. Vance stood up. He buttoned his custom navy suit jacket with a slick, practiced motion. He looked down at Jillian. She smiled, her red lips parting perfectly, and squeezed his hand one more time. Vance walked up the carpeted steps to the grand stage. He stepped directly into the blinding spotlight. Clara watched from table 42. The air in her lungs turned completely to ice. Vance shook the director's hand, took the heavy crystal trophy, and stepped up to the microphone. He leaned in, flashing his brilliant, charismatic smile. The camera flashes fired in rapid succession, illuminating his face in harsh bursts of white light. "Thank you," Vance said. His voice echoed through the massive speakers, deep and resonant. "This is an incredible honor. When I started at this firm, I had nothing but ambition. I knew that to reach the top, I had to surround myself with the right people, people who understood the vision." He paused, looking directly down at table 4. "Which is why," Vance continued, his voice softening into a tone of deep, public reverence, "I have to thank the woman who has been my true rock, the woman behind the scenes who helped me secure the largest accounts of the quarter. Jillian, please stand." Jillian stood up. The diamonds around her neck glittered under the chandelier. The applause swelled again. The regional director clapped approvingly. The senior partners nodded. They were looking at her with absolute respect. "Thank you, Jillian," Vance said smoothly, "for being my partner in every sense of the word." Clara sat in the shadows of the kitchen doors. Her hands rested flat against the table. The freezing cold spread from her chest out to her fingertips. "Now, people often ask me how I balance it all." Vance laughed softly into the microphone. It was a calculated, charming chuckle, and I would be remiss if I did not mention my wife, Clara. The ballroom grew slightly quieter. Heads turned, scanning the front tables, looking for a wife. They did not see one. She is safely tucked away in the very back tonight, right next to the kitchen, Vance said, pointing vaguely toward the dark corner where Clara sat. "I think she is hoping they will let her borrow an apron and bake some bread while the adults talk business." A ripple of laughter moved through the front tables. Jillian smirked, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "But seriously," Vance continued, riding the wave of the crowd's amusement, "pregnancy hormones are a wild ride. Folks, let us give her a round of applause for just staying awake past 8 o'clock. The laughter of 300 people echoed in the room as Vance spoke her name like a punchline. It was not a roaring, malicious laughter. It was worse. It was casual, dismissive amusement. It was the sound of a room full of powerful people accepting that Vance Sterling S. wife was a simple, hormonal, domestic joke who did not belong in their world. Clara did not scream. She did not cry. The old Clara died in that chair. The woman who had clipped coupons, who had swallowed her mother-in-law's insults, who had folded tiny white socks at 2 in the morning while her husband planned to replace her, that woman ceased to exist. Clara stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and completely silent. She stepped away from table 42. She smoothed down the front of her midnight black silk maternity dress with both hands. It was a gesture of absolute, terrifying composure. She was not hiding her pregnancy. She was wearing it like armor. She began to walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. At first, no one noticed her, but as she moved past table 30, then table 20, the heavy silk of her dress catching the ambient light, the whispering began to change. She did not look like a tired, hormonal housewife, with her deep crimson lipstick, her sharp features, and the absolute, freezing calm radiating from her eyes. She looked like a queen walking to a guillotine, but she was not the one whose head was about to roll. By the time she reached table 10, the laughter had completely died. The ballroom fell into a tense, confused silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of her dress and the quiet click of her flat shoes on the polished floor. On the stage, Vance's smile faltered. The blinding spotlight suddenly seemed to expose the sudden sheen of sweat on his forehead. He gripped the edge of the podium. He had expected her to cry. He had expected her to run out the back door in shame. He had not expected her to march directly into the light. Clara reached the edge of the stage. She stopped right in front of table 4. Jillian was staring at her, the smirk frozen and slowly dissolving on her painted red lips. Clara did not look at Jillian. She looked up at Vance. Clara, Vance hissed, leaning away from the microphone. His voice was a panicked whisper that only the front row could hear. What are you doing? Sit down. You are making a scene. Clara tilted her head slightly. The silence in the massive room was deafening. You wanted everyone to look at me. Vance, Clara said. She did not yell. She spoke with a quiet, icy authority that carried effortlessly to the senior partners sitting at table 4. I am just giving them a better view. Panic flashed in Vance's eyes. He realized instantly that he had miscalculated. He covered the microphone with his hand. He looked past Clara, making frantic eye contact with a man in a black suit standing near the emergency exit. Security, Vance mouthed silently, waving his hand in a dismissive, urgent gesture. 2 large security guards immediately stepped away from the wall and began walking briskly toward the front of the room. My wife is not feeling well, Vance announced into the microphone, forcing a strained, artificial smile. The stress of the evening is a bit much for her. Please excuse the interruption. The 2 guards reached Clara, the larger one. A man with a thick neck and an earpiece reached out to grab her arm. Clara did not flinch. She did not step back. She simply turned her head and looked at the guard's hand hovering inches from her silk sleeve. "If you touch me," Clara said softly, her voice colder than the ice melting in the crystal water glasses, "you will never work in this city again." The guard hesitated, confused by the absolute certainty in her tone. But Vance was desperate. He was watching his perfect night unravel. "Escort her out," he hissed at the guards. Now, the guard took a breath and reached for Clara's arm again. He never made contact. Chapter 7. The fleet arrives. The security guard's thick fingers closed roughly around Clara's upper arm. Clara did not struggle. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked down at the hand, grabbing her midnight black silk dress, and then looked back up at Vance, the terrified, pathetic desperation in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was a small man, terrified of losing a small kingdom. "I will walk myself out," Clara said perfectly clearly. She pulled her arm out of the guard's grip. She turned on her heel and began the long walk toward the ballroom doors. She did not look back. The two guards flanked her tightly, treating a pregnant woman like a dangerous criminal. Behind her, the ballroom erupted into a chaotic buzz of whispers. Vance realized immediately that the damage was not contained. He dropped the heavy crystal trophy onto the podium. He practically jumped off the stage, abandoning the microphone, abandoning the regional director. He needed to make sure Clara was truly gone before he could spin his web of excuses. Jillian, sensing the tension, hurried after him. The senior partners, fueled by morbid curiosity, followed them out. The heavy wooden doors swung open. Clara stepped into the expansive, cold marble of the hotel lobby. The air out here was entirely different. It was quiet. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows looked out into the stormy night. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, blurring the streetlights into streaks of yellow and red. Out the side door, Ma'am, the larger security guard, growled, reaching for her arm again to hurry her along. "The management does not want a scene in the main lobby." The security guard reached for her arm, but a voice like thunder stopped him dead. It did not come from a person. It came from the screaming screech of heavy tires skidding on wet pavement. A blinding wash of amber and white light suddenly swept across the dark lobby, illuminating the marble floor in harsh, flashing strokes outside the glass doors. The storm was violently interrupted. Four massive, armored black SUVs jumped the concrete curb. They completely bypassed the valet line, slamming into park in a tight, defensive semicircle directly in front of the grand glass entrance. The hotel security guards froze. They let go of Clara entirely, their hands dropping to their heavy-duty belts. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots hit the wet pavement. Over a dozen men in sharp, tailored black suits and tactical earpieces poured out of the vehicles. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision. Two men immediately secured the perimeter. Four men flanked the glass doors. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, electronic hum. The cold, wet wind howled into the lobby, bringing with it the sharp scent of rain and exhaust. Brooks stepped through the doors first. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, his face set in a mask of absolute, furious stone. He did not look at the hotel security. He did not look at the crowd of executives now spilling out of the ballroom doors behind Clara. He only looked at his sister, right behind Brooks. An older man stepped into the lobby. Harrison wore a bespoke midnight blue overcoat. His silver hair was perfectly swept back. His eyes were cold, sharp, and ruthless. He carried a heavy, polished mahogany cane with a solid silver handle. Harrison's private security detail flooded the lobby. In less than 3 seconds, they surrounded the hotel security guards. One of Harrison's men stepped between Clara and the large guard who had grabbed her arm. The private security agent simply stared down at the hotel guard, daring him to move a single muscle. The hotel guard swallowed hard and took a slow, terrified step backward. The lobby was packed now. Vance had pushed his way to the front of the crowd, with Jillian clutching his arm. The regional director and the senior board members stood just behind them, staring in absolute shock at the tactical invasion of their prestigious gala. What is the meaning of this? Vance demanded loudly, trying to regain control of his night. Who are you people? Call the police. This is a private corporate event. Harrison stopped walking. He stood in the center of the marble floor. He slowly turned his head and looked at Vance. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was the look a man gives to an insect right before he steps on it. The cane struck the marble floor. Crack. Silence fell over the room. The sharp gunshot sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Nobody breathed. The regional director of Vance's firm suddenly pushed past Jillian. His face had gone completely pale. All the blood had drained from his cheeks. He took a trembling step forward, his eyes fixed on the older man standing in the center of the room. Mr. Harrison, the regional director choked out. His voice was trembling. Sir, we had no idea you were coming tonight. We would have prepared the executive suite. A collective gasp moved through the crowd of executives. Harrison, the name was legendary in their world. He was the invisible hand that moved the markets. He was the primary shareholder of the parent company that owned the very firm Vance worked for. Vance froze. His heart completely stopped. He looked at the regional director. He looked at the terrifying billionaire standing in the lobby. And then he looked at Clara. Vance's smug smile vanished as he recognized the billionaire standing between him and his wife. Harrison ignored the regional director completely. He ignored Vance. He walked straight past them, his cane clicking steadily against the floor. He walked right up to Clara. The terrifying, ruthless tycoon softened instantly. His cold eyes melted into absolute warmth. He reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched Clara's cheek. You are beautiful, my girl, Harrison whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. I am so sorry I was not here sooner. You are right on time. Dad, Clara said softly. The word dropped into the silent lobby like a bomb. Dad, Jillian let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to cover her red lips. Vance physically stumbled backward. hitting the brass luggage cart behind him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The charity case. The suburban housewife with no pedigree. The woman he had just publicly humiliated and tried to throw out the back door. She was Clara Harrison. Brooks walked over and stood protectively beside his sister. He looked directly at Vance. We bought the corporate debt at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Vance, Brooks said, his voice ringing clearly across the quiet lobby. We own this hotel. We own your firm. And as of 10 minutes ago, we own the mortgage on your suburban house. Vance began to shake. He looked at Jillian, but she had already taken 2 steps away from him, her eyes wide with terror. Clara, Vance gasped, holding his hands out in a pathetic, pleading gesture. Clara, please. There has been a misunderstanding. I did not mean it. Clara looked at the man she had loved for 5 years. He looked so incredibly small. The terrifying composure that had carried her through the night finally settled into absolute, unshakable peace. There is no misunderstanding, Vance, Clara said. Before she could say another word, a sharp, white-hot spike of pain suddenly ripped through her lower abdomen. Clara gasped, her hands instinctively flying to her stomach. Her knees buckled. The stress, the betrayal, the adrenaline of the last 48 hours. Her body had held on as long as it could, but the dam had finally broken. Clara, Brooks shouted, catching her before she hit the marble floor. The pain ripped through her, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. The longest winter night had just begun. Chapter 8. The Shift and the Storm. The marble floor was freezing, but Clara barely felt it. Another contraction hit her, a violent, ripping wave that stole the air directly from her lungs. She gripped her brother S. forearm. Her knuckles turned completely white. The lobby had descended into total chaos. The executives were shouting. The hotel staff was frantically speaking into their radios. And through it all, Vance was trying to push his way past the wall of black-suited security agents. Clara, Vance screamed. His voice was shrill, entirely stripped of its polished corporate veneer. Let me through. She is my wife. You cannot just take her. Brooks scooped Clara up into his arms effortlessly. He did not even look back at Vance. Harrison, however, stopped at the sliding glass doors. He turned his head slowly. The billionaire looked at the pathetic, panicked man who had just spent the last 5 years trying to break his daughter's spirit. She is not your wife, Harrison said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute weight of a death sentence. She is my blood, and you are nothing. Harrison gave a brief nod to his head of security. The massive agent stepped forward, placed a flat hand against Vance's chest, and shoved him violently backward. Vance flew back, crashing hard into the brass luggage cart. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, while his colleagues watched in horrified silence. Jillian did not run to help him. She backed away, disappearing into the crowd. Brooks carried Clara through the sliding glass doors and out into the roaring storm. He placed her gently into the back seat of the lead-armored SUV. The interior smelled intensely of rich leather and the crisp, ozone scent of the rain. Harrison climbed in right behind them. The heavy steel doors slammed shut. Thud, the screaming wind, the flashing lights, and the pathetic sight of Vance Sterling were instantly locked outside. Drive. Harrison ordered the driver. Call ahead. Tell Dr. Evans we are 10 minutes out. Tell him to clear the entire private wing. The engine roared. The convoy of black vehicles peeled out of the hotel driveway, their heavy tires cutting fiercely through the flooded streets. Clara leaned her head back against the leather seat. She squeezed her eyes shut as another contraction tore through her lower back. It was too early. She was only 8 months along. The stress, the shock, and the absolute heartbreak of the evening had triggered a premature labor. Breathe, my girl, Harrison whispered. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm, calloused, and perfectly steady. It was a hand that had built empires, but right now, it was just the hand of a terrified father holding his little girl. I have you. We are almost there. My phone, Clara gasped, opening her eyes. She looked at Brooks. Brooks in my purse. Call Margot. Brooks did not ask questions. He reached into her black clutch, pulled out her phone, and dialed the number. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly. The heavy sheets of rain slapping against the tinted windows began to crystallize. The water turned into sharp, driving sleet, rattling against the glass like thrown gravel. The longest winter night had arrived. Within minutes, the convoy skidded to a halt under the brightly lit canopy of the city's most exclusive private medical center. The doors flew open. A team of nurses and doctors was already waiting on the pavement with a gurney. The sharp, stinging smell of clinical antiseptic immediately filled Clara S. nose, cutting through the scent of the rain. They lifted her onto the gurney. The wheels squeaked rapidly against the pristine linoleum floors. Bright fluorescent lights flashed overhead in a dizzying rhythm as they rushed her down the long, sterile corridors. Heart rate is elevated. A nurse called out. She is 34 weeks, Dr. Evans said, jogging alongside the gurney. He was a calm, older man with steady eyes. We need to monitor the baby's stress levels immediately. Let us get her into room 1. They burst through the heavy double doors of the private maternity suite. Brooks and Harrison were forced to stay behind in the waiting room. Clara was suddenly surrounded by strangers, bright lights, and the terrifying reality of her own body. The physical pain was blinding. It crashed over her in relentless, punishing waves. But the emotional pain was worse as the doctors hooked her up to the monitors, attaching cold sensors to her swollen belly. The reality of the last 4 hours finally crashed down on her. Her marriage was a lie. Her husband had despised her. He had planned to use her, abandon her, and replace her with a woman who wore his affection like a cheap trophy. She had spent 5 years shrinking herself, making herself invisible, folding tiny white socks in the dark while the man she loved plotted her destruction. A heavy, jagged sob tore out of her throat. It was not just the pain of the contractions. It was the pain of mourning a life that had never really existed. It was the agonizing, tearing sensation of ripping a toxic root out of her own heart. You are doing beautifully. Clara, Dr. Evans said gently, I need you to push on the next contraction. You are incredibly strong. Clara gripped the cold metal rails of the hospital bed. I am strong, she thought. I am not a charity case. I am not a stepping stone. She closed her eyes. She pictured Vance on the stage. She pictured Jillian S. Red Lips. She pictured the suffocating, yellow walls of the nursery she had painted for a ghost. She took all the anger, all the humiliation, all the bitter betrayal, and she channeled it directly into her body. She pushed. She pushed out the weakness. She pushed out the apologies. She pushed out the woman who had begged for scraps of affection from a starving man. The monitor hummed rapidly. Beep, beep, beep. One more time. Clara, the doctor encouraged. Almost there. Clara took a massive, shuddering breath. The pieces finally fell into place. She did not need Vance to give her a family. She already had one. She did not need Vance to give her a home. She was the home. With one final, agonizing effort, the room suddenly erupted into a different kind of sound. It was a sharp, furious, and incredibly beautiful cry. It is a girl. Dr. Evans smiled behind his surgical mask. A beautiful, healthy baby girl. Clara fell back against the pillows. Her chest was heaving. Her entire body was trembling with exhaustion. But as the nurse wiped the baby clean and wrapped her in a warm, soft blanket, the heavy, suffocating weight in Clara S. chest vanished completely. They placed the baby gently onto Clara S. chest. Clara looked down at the tiny, red, screaming face. The baby had a full head of dark hair. She was tiny, weighing just over 5 pounds, but her cry was fierce and demanding. She was a fighter. Hello, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, running hot down her cheeks. Hello, my beautiful girl. I have got you. I promise you. I will never let anyone make you feel small. An hour later, the chaotic energy of the delivery room had entirely faded. Clara was moved into the VIP recovery suite. The room was massive, resembling a luxury hotel room more than a hospital ward. The lights were dimmed to a soft, warm amber. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic hum of the medical monitors. The door creaked open slowly. Margot walked in. She was wearing sweatpants and a heavy winter coat pulled hastily over her pajamas. Her hair was a messy knot on top of her head. When she saw Clara sitting up in the bed, holding the sleeping infant, Margot's tough, sharp-tongued exterior instantly crumbled. She walked over to the bed, pulled up a chair, and sat down heavily. She looked at the baby, and then she looked at Clara S.'s exhausted, peaceful face. Margot reached out and took Clara S.'s hand. Honey, Margot whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I have been biting my tongue for 3 years. I never liked him. Clara let out a weak, genuine laugh. It hurt her stomach, but it felt incredibly good. I know, Margot. Clara smiled softly. I know. Margot squeezed her hand tightly. Brooks told me everything in the hallway. They bought the firm. Clara, Vance is completely ruined. He has been blowing up your phone for 2 hours, crying like a child. The security guards threw him off the hospital property. Clara did not feel a thrill of vicious victory. She just felt tired. Vance was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight was for breathing. Mark kissed Clara's cheek, promised to return in the morning, and slipped quietly out of the room. Brooks and Harrison were sleeping in the private waiting area down the hall, standing guard like two loyal wolves. Clara was finally alone with her daughter. She reached over with her free hand and picked up a small plastic cup from the bedside table. It was filled with crushed ice. She placed a small chip of ice on her tongue. The cold, sharp water felt like absolute heaven against her dry throat. She turned her head and looked out the massive window of the recovery suite. The storm had completely changed. The violent, driving rain was gone. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Now, thick, pure white snowflakes were falling slowly and silently from the dark sky. They drifted past the glass, covering the ugly, gray concrete of the city in a blanket of clean, brilliant white. Clara sat in the hospital bed, holding the cup of ice chips, watching the snow fall outside the window. She listened to the soft breathing of her daughter. She felt the heavy, solid presence of her father and brother just down the hall. The longest winter night had passed. The cold was no longer something to fear. It was something that protected her. She was completely safe. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 3 days later, the storm had entirely passed. The VIP recovery suite was bathed in bright, crisp winter sunlight. The room was perfectly silent, save for the steady ticking of the silver wall clock. Tick, tock, tick. Clara sat in a plush velvet armchair by the window. She wore a soft, thick cashmere robe. Her hair was brushed and fell neatly over her shoulders. The physical pain of the delivery was fading, replaced by a deep, hollow ache of exhaustion. But her mind had never been sharper. The heavy oak door opened with a soft click. Brooks stepped into the room. He was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit, holding a thick manila folder in his left hand. He looked at Clara, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and quiet respect. "How is she?" Brooks asked, his voice low. "She is sleeping," Clara answered, looking toward the small, transparent bassinet near the bed. "Dr. Evans said she is gaining weight beautifully. We can take her home in a few days." Brooks smiled softly. He walked over and looked down at his newborn niece for a long moment before turning his attention back to his sister. His face hardened, returning to the ruthless businessman he was trained to be. "It is done," Brooks said. He dropped the heavy folder onto the small glass table next to Clara. The crisp rustle of the thick legal paper sounded loud in the quiet room. "The acquisition was finalized yesterday morning. We completely dismantled Vance's firm. The regional director personally flew to Dad S. estate to offer a formal apology. He was terrified." Clara reached out and touched the edge of the folder. "And Vance." "Fired," Brooks stated flatly. "Blacklisted from every major financial institution in the tri-state area. Dad called in a few favors. Nobody will touch him. As for his personal assets, we called in the mortgage on the suburban house. The locks were changed at dawn. Clara felt a strange, quiet flutter in her chest. It was not pity. It was simply the absolute finality of closing a door she would never walk through again. What about Jillian? Clara asked. Brooks let out a short, humorless laugh. She packed her apartment yesterday. She transferred to a branch office in Chicago. The second Vance lost his title and his bank account. She blocked his number and disappeared. He has absolutely nothing. Clara nodded slowly. He loved the power he had over me, she thought, and now he has no power over anyone. He is downstairs. Brooks continued, his jaw tightening. He has been pacing the perimeter of the hospital parking lot for 3 days. Our security has blocked him at every entrance, but he is begging to see you. Just say the word, and I will have him permanently removed by the police. Clara looked out the window. The snow was piled high on the city streets, bright and blinding in the morning sun. She did not want to see him. She wanted to erase him entirely. But she knew that to truly heal, she had to face the ghost of her past one last time. She had to show him exactly who had won. Bring him up, Clara said. Brooks frowned deeply. Clara, you do not have to do this. You owe him nothing. I know, Clara replied, her voice perfectly calm. But I need him to see me. Bring him up. Give us 2 minutes. Brooks hesitated, but he recognized the unshakable authority in his sister S. eyes. He nodded once, turned and left the room. Clara stood up. She tightened the belt of her cashmere robe. She did not pace. She did not wring her hands. She simply stood in the center of the luxurious room, waiting. 5 minutes later, the door opened. Vance walked in. Clara almost did not recognize him. The polished, arrogant executive from the Starlight Room was completely gone. His custom Italian suit was wrinkled and stained. His silk tie was missing, his collar unbuttoned. He had not shaved in 3 days. Dark, heavy bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. He smelled of stale sweat, bitter coffee, and absolute desperation. The contrast between his unkempt appearance and the sterile, luxurious cleanliness of the hospital suite was staggering. He stopped a few feet inside the room. He looked at Clara. He looked at the massive suite. He looked at the baby sleeping quietly in the corner. Clara, Vance gasped. His voice was hoarse, cracking on the first syllable. Keep your voice down, Clara commanded softly. She is sleeping. Vance swallowed hard. He took a hesitant step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He immediately reverted to his old tactics: deflect, minimize, deny. Clara, this has all been a massive misunderstanding, Vance began, forcing a pathetic, trembling smile. The gala, the things I said on that stage. I was under so much pressure. The board was breathing down my neck. You have to believe me. I never meant any of it. Clara just stared at him. The silence stretched between them. The silver clock ticked. Tick, tock, tick. And Jillian, Vance stammered. The sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool room temperature. Jillian means absolutely nothing to me. She threw herself at me. Clara, she manipulated the situation. You know how these corporate climbers are. I was going to fire her on Monday. Clara did not blink. He is not sorry he broke my heart. She thought with absolute, terrifying clarity. He is only sorry he lost his wallet. You called me dead weight. Vance, Clara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. Vance physically flinched. The blood drained entirely from his face. He realized instantly that she had heard him in his office. He realized she had known everything before the gala even began. I was angry, Vance pleaded, his voice rising in panic. I was stupid. Clara, please. You cannot let your father do this to me. I lost my job. I am locked out of our house. I have $20 in my checking account. My entire life is ruined. Your life is exactly what you built it to be, Clara replied. You built it on lies. You built it on betrayal. I am simply the consequence. Vance's knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, right in the center of the plush carpet. He was on his knees now, begging the woman he had just tried to throw away. I am a father now, Vance cried, tears finally spilling down his unshaven cheeks. He reached out, trying to grab the hem of Clara's robe. You cannot keep me from my daughter. We are a family. Please, Clara, I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. I will go to counseling. Just tell your father to back off. Clara took a deliberate step backward, keeping her robe entirely out of his reach. She looked down at him. The man on the floor was a stranger. The man she had loved had never existed. She turned away from him and walked over to the glass table. She picked up the heavy manila folder Brooks had left behind. She opened it. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents. You will not go to counseling, Clara said, pulling a silver pen from the table. You will not see my daughter, and you will not contact me ever again. She dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the table right in front of him. These are divorce papers, Clara explained, her tone entirely conversational, as if she were reading a grocery list. They include a full relinquishment of your parental rights. In exchange, my family will clear your outstanding personal debts. You walk away with nothing, but you walk away free. If you try to fight me in court, my father's lawyers will keep you tied up in litigation until you are an old, broken man. Vance stared at the papers through his tears. He was shaking violently. He knew he had lost. He had no money to fight her. He had no reputation left to stand on. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. Clara unscrewed the cap of the silver pen. She leaned over the table. She signed her name on the bottom line. The pen scratched aggressively against the thick paper. Scratch, scratch. She stared at her own signature on the bottom line. The ink was dark blue. She stared at it for a long, quiet moment. She almost did not recognize her own handwriting. It was not the tight, hesitant script of the woman who used to write his grocery lists. It was the signature of a stranger, a stronger, unbreakable stranger. She signed her name, closed the folder, and took her life back. She slid the folder across the glass table toward Vance. Sign it, Clara ordered. Clara, please. Vance sobbed, his face buried in his hands. Sign it, Vance. Clara repeated, her voice dropping to a terrifying register. Or I call Brooks back into this room, and we take the debt deal off the table. Vance slowly raised his head. He looked into her eyes. He searched frantically for the soft, forgiving woman he had married. He searched for the charity case he could manipulate. He found nothing but cold, impenetrable iron. His hand trembled violently as he reached for the silver pen. He pulled the folder toward him. He did not read the terms. He did not read the custody arrangement. He just flipped to the back page and scribbled his name. It was the ultimate success victory. She kept her absolute grace, while he completely collapsed on the floor. Clara picked up the folder. She did not say goodbye. She did not offer him a final word of comfort. She simply turned her back on him and walked over to the bassinet. She looked down at her sleeping daughter. Brooks, Clara called out clearly. The heavy oak door opened instantly. Brooks stepped inside, accompanied by two massive private security agents. "Mr. Sterling is leaving," Clara said, not taking her eyes off her child. The two agents walked forward. They grabbed Vance by his arms and hauled him forcefully to his feet. He did not fight back. He hung between them like a broken doll. As they dragged him toward the door, Vance looked back over his shoulder one last time. He saw Clara standing in the sunlight, bathed in the warmth of her true family, holding a world he would never, ever be allowed to touch again. The heavy oak door slammed shut. Thud, the room was quiet again. The ticking of the clock returned. Clara took a deep breath of the clean, sterile hospital air. The stale smell of his cologne was already fading. The reckoning was over. The slate was clean. Clara reached down and gently touched her daughter's tiny, warm hand. The baby stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny fingers wrapping instinctively around Clara's thumb. A slow, genuine smile spread across Clara's face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. The longest winter was finally over. Spring was just around the corner. Chapter 10. Spring Without Warning. 6 months later, the heavy, suffocating air of the suburban house was a lifetime away. Clara sat on the expansive stone terrace of her new estate. The morning sun was incredibly warm, casting long, golden rays across the manicured lawns. The air smelled of fresh blooming jasmine and rich, dark roast coffee. In her lap, little Grace let out a soft, happy coo. Clara smiled, looking down at her 6-month-old daughter. Grace was thriving. She had bright, observant eyes and a head of soft, dark curls. She was kicking her little legs against the soft cotton of her blanket, entirely captivated by the sunlight filtering through the oak trees. The porcelain coffee cup clinked against the matching saucer. Clink, Clara took a sip. It was perfect. She leaned her head back against the cushioned wicker chair and closed her eyes. She listened to the gentle rustle of the leaves in the spring breeze. She listened to the distant, rhythmic sound of the fountain in the garden. She listened to the steady, strong beating of her own heart. She was living on a sprawling property just 2 miles down the road from her father and brother. The physical proximity was a comfort, but the emotional closeness was the true revelation. For 5 years, she had run away from them, believing that their wealth and power made them incapable of real love. She had been wrong. Harrison had not smothered her upon her return. He had given her space. Brooks had not interrogated her. He had simply built a fortress around her while she healed. They had given her exactly what she needed to rebuild her life from absolutely zero. A sharp crunch of gravel in the circular driveway interrupted the quiet morning. Clara opened her eyes. A sleek silver sedan pulled up to the front steps. The driver's door popped open, and Margot stepped out. She was wearing her usual chaotic mix of bright colors, holding a large pink pastry box in one hand and her oversized sunglasses in the other. "I brought croissants," Margot announced loudly, marching up the stone steps toward the terrace. "The good ones, from that bakery downtown that charges entirely too much for butter and flour." Clara laughed softly. It was a rich, genuine sound that carried across the terrace. "You know my chef already made breakfast, Margot." "Your chef makes healthy food," Margot said, waving a dismissive hand as she pulled up a chair next to Clara. "I make sure you do not forget the joy of refined sugar. It is my duty as your best friend." Margot set the pink box on the patio table. She immediately reached over and gently tickled Grace's chin. The baby giggled, reaching her tiny hands up toward Margot's bright beaded necklace. Margot took off her sunglasses and looked at Clara. She really looked at her. "You look amazing, Clara," Margot said. Her voice dropped its usual sarcastic edge, becoming completely sincere. "I mean it. You are glowing. It is like looking at a completely different person." "I feel like a different person," Clara answered quietly. It was true. Finding herself again had not been a sudden, dramatic explosion. It had been a slow, quiet daily practice. It was in the way she no longer apologized to the wait staff for ordering exactly what she wanted. It was in the way she wore bright, beautiful clothes without wondering if they were too loud. It was in the way she looked in the mirror and finally recognized the woman looking back. Margot opened the pastry box and pulled out a massive, flaky croissant. "I heard a rumor through the corporate grapevine yesterday," Margot said casually, tearing the pastry in half, "about a certain someone." Clara did not flinch. Her heart rate did not spike. 6 months ago, the mere mention of Vance would have sent her into a spiral of anxiety. Today, she just felt a mild, passing curiosity. "Oh," Clara asked, shifting Grace into a more comfortable position. "He is working at a regional car rental desk out in Ohio." Margot grinned, taking a bite, apparently. "When you get blacklisted by Harrison Global, the only people willing to hire you are the ones handing out keys to economy sedans." He tried to call a few of the junior partners last week, begging for a character reference. They all hung up on him. Clara looked out over the blooming garden. She pictured Vance in a cheap polyester uniform, standing behind a plastic counter in Ohio. She pictured his desperation. She pictured his endless, pathetic ambition reduced to asking strangers for their driver's licenses. She felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no vindication, just a profound, peaceful indifference. "I wish him well," Clara said, and she meant it. Margot stopped chewing and stared at her. "You are kidding." "Right. I want him to step on a Lego every single morning for the rest of his miserable life." Holding on to anger is exhausting. Margot Clara smiled gently. He gave me grace. He pushed me out the door when I was too afraid to open it myself. He played his part, and now his part is completely over. Margot shook her head in awe. You are a better woman than me. Clara, I would have bought the rental car company just to fire him again. Clara laughed, leaning down to kiss the top of her daughter's head. The smell of baby powder and sweet milk filled her senses. Margot stayed for another hour, eating pastries, gossiping about the city, and holding Grace while Clara drank her coffee in peace. When Margot finally stood up to leave, she gave Clara a tight, lingering hug. I am so proud of you, Margot whispered fiercely. Thank you for never giving up on me, Clara replied. Margot walked back to her car. The engine started with a smooth purr. The silver sedan rolled down the long, tree-lined driveway, disappearing beyond the iron gates of the estate. Clara was alone again. She stood up from the wicker chair. She held Grace securely against her chest and walked over to the edge of the stone terrace. The garden below was a riot of color. White hydrangeas, purple lilacs, and deep pink climbing roses were all blooming at once. It was a spectacular, unapologetic display of life. It was a spring without warning. Clara looked out at the horizon. The sky was an endless, brilliant blue for years. She had believed that safety meant staying small. She had believed that if she just folded herself into a neat little box, she would be loved. She had believed that Vance held the key to her happiness. She finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked the whole time. She had been her own jailer. She had made herself small so a weak man could feel tall. She had sacrificed her inheritance, her name, and her voice, all to prove she was worthy of a mediocre love. But the truth was, she had always been worthy. The power had always been hers. She just had to be brave enough to claim it. Clara held her daughter a little closer. Grace rested her tiny head against Clara's shoulder, her breathing slow and steady. The hardest part is admitting I knew all along. The best part is knowing I never have to forget again. She would raise Grace differently. She would teach her daughter how to take up space. She would teach her how to speak her mind without hesitation. She would teach her that love should never require a woman to shrink. A gentle breeze swept across the terrace, catching the hem of Clara's light silk dress. It felt like a deep, cleansing breath. Her future opened up before her. It was not a future built on secrets. It was not a future built on apologies. It was a future entirely of her own making. The storm had washed away the illusion, leaving only the solid, unbreakable bedrock beneath. Clara turned around and walked back toward the open French doors of her beautiful home. She stepped inside, leaving the shadows of her past outside on the terrace, forever fading in the bright, unyielding sunlight. The journey was over. The destination was beautiful, and the rest of her life was just beginning.
As the screen fades to black on Clara and Vance's story, it leaves us with a profound space for reflection. At its core, this is not just a tale about hidden billions or dramatic corporate takeovers. It is a deeply human story about the dangerous compromises we make in the name of love. and the terrifying, beautiful process of taking our power back. For 5 years, Clara committed the ultimate betrayal not against her husband, but against herself. She believed that to be loved, she had to be simple. She hid her legacy, her intelligence, and her strength, folding herself into a tiny, suffocating box just so Vance could feel like a giant. How many of us have done exactly that? How many times have we dimmed our own light, silenced our own opinions, or accepted blatant disrespect just to keep the peace in a relationship, a friendship, or a workplace? Clara's journey teaches us that you cannot build a healthy life on a foundation of self-erasure. When you make yourself small for someone else, you do not earn their love. You only earn their disrespect. Vance looked at her sacrifices and saw weakness. He looked at her loyalty and saw a liability. He was a man obsessed with the illusion of power, completely blind to the fact that he was already holding the keys to the kingdom. But the true victory in this story does not happen when the billionaire father arrives with a fleet of armored SUVs. The true victory happens in the dark, quiet moments. It happens when Clara is sitting alone in that hospital stairwell, realizing that she is not crazy, she is not weak, and she is done apologizing for existing. That cold, terrifying clarity is the moment her life truly changes. Revenge, in its healthiest form, is not about screaming or throwing plates. It is about absolute, unshakable boundaries. Clara did not have to raise her voice to destroy Vance's world. She simply had to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. She let him fall. The most beautiful takeaway from this story is the concept of a spring without warning. Life will break you. People you trust will fail you. You will find yourself standing in the freezing cold of your own disappointment. But when you finally stop holding on to the toxic elements in your life, when you sign your name and walk away, you make room for the sun. You make room for a life that is entirely of your own making. Never apologize for the space you take up. Never hide your crown to make someone else comfortable. You are worthy of a love that celebrates your greatness, not one that demands your silence. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.